What's up guys, Cirrus here. Today I've got something a little bit different than what you might be used to. This is a bit of a live conversation me and Steve McRae had recently. We had been discussing different things that we had seen happen in the theist versus atheist conversation that we had started to get very agitated with from both sides. Before we do that, we need to announce the winners of the last poll, and 71% of you said that the Shroud of Turin was fake. And everyone else voted that they had better blankets. Speaking of blankets, I hope that the Shroud of Turin issue can finally be once and for all put to bed. Stay tuned until the end of the video for the next contest. Hey, what's up guys, Cirrus here. Well, there's a thing that has been going on for a while now that I've desperately wanted to address, and a good friend of mine, Steve McRae, has actually been wanting to address as well, and it's certain things that we're starting to get really tired of hearing in conversation. I'm sure that there's a whole lot of atheists out there that have had just a few things they're tired of hearing theists listen to, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot of things that the theists are tired of listening to as well. So with that said, how's it going, Steve?
Hey, Cirrus, how you doing, my friend?
I am doing pretty well for the time being. I'm hopefully going to be upgrading my computer here in a bit, just because this one is taking hours and hours to render video, and I'm starting to get tired of waiting for hours and hours of videos to render. But with that said, I know that there's a few concepts in conversation that we're definitely tired of listening to over and over, and if you cringe, please let me know. The atheist worldview.
Yeah, that's something that I don't understand on a variety of levels. So first, the position of atheism, as just about everybody realizes by now, only deals with one proposition. It is the existential nature of God. That is it. Whether you define it as lack of belief or belief that God does not exist, either or, it does not matter. It still only relates to the existence of God. A worldview, however, is not just a single proposition. A worldview is your theory of knowledge on the world. And so to say atheist worldview makes absolutely no sense to me, because it's trying to distill an entire framework, an entire theory of knowledge, how you look upon the world, into one single thing. And that to me doesn't make sense.
And I'd say on the converse of that, I also really hate hearing the Christian worldview, because let's be honest, what actually would be the Christian worldview? I would like somebody to really define that for me in a way that is not strawmanning the other side, because as far as Christians are concerned, I could say the Christian worldview, and what I actually say might come out as a young earth creationist worldview, which is not all Christians, or I might say something about the way that the knowledge of God means that everything is deterministic, and at that point I might be talking more about a Calvinist God. But again, that's not the Christian worldview. That's the worldview of a subset, and within those subsets you're going to have individuals that still have differing beliefs and differing worldviews based on their philosophy and based on their theology. So when you say the insert label here worldview, I don't think you can ever say that without it actually being a straw man, unless you're talking about an individual person.
And that's why generally I avoid the term worldview altogether. And the reason being is because I don't think it's possible to really distill it down to one thing. And so when you say something like the Christian worldview, and by the way, it's actually the more Christians that use these terms. You'll hear Christians say worldview more than an atheist, generally speaking. So when they even refer to themselves from a Christian worldview, it takes some time to determine what they mean by that, because as you pointed out, there's so many different variations of what that would entail. I don't know why they would even bother to even call it a worldview any longer, because you're not dealing with a worldview that's a collective thing of positions. They're trying to, again, saying, I have one position, I'm a Christian, and my entire theory of knowledge of the universe can be just surmised in one single phrase, Christian worldview. And you know, it's fine if they want to do that. Again, I'll have a discussion with somebody who wants to label their own position that way. If they say, hey, from my Christian view, okay, I get that. I take umbrage when they try to apply that to other people and they say, from your atheist worldview or your agnostic worldview. Then there's a problem, because then they are trying to use their terminology on somebody else that may not particularly hold to having such a position of a worldview, because I don't have an agnostic worldview. I don't think you have an atheist worldview. It just makes no sense to call them worldviews.
No, and it really doesn't. And the funny thing is, at least for the agnostic/atheist thing, me and Steve hold an almost identical position. So when you say the agnostic worldview and the atheist worldview, the only position we don't hold on that is how we use the terms to label ourselves. Past that, the actual position's the same. And I think therein exemplifies one of the biggest problems with trying to label anybody with having a worldview, because if you said agnostic worldview or atheist worldview, you have two different people here who have the same response on this topic.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's one of the problems. Like, you and I both agree that, like, your colloquial atheism is the same as agnosticism. Matter of fact, I was just watching Talk Heathen today. Love that show. Great show. Bet one of the best, if not the best, Colin show on YouTube. But even Talk Heathen recognizes in the video description that what they call atheism, they even say most people, even use that word most, call that agnosticism, which I think is credible to them, that they are at least distinguishing between these things. They understand there is a difference. They're not trying to have an equivocation issue. That's why you and I pretty much agree on everything. It's just, what do we want to call ourselves? But what these positions mean, I think we have no disagreement whatsoever.
No, I don't. My only thing is I think that I find more use in the normalization of atheism, so I would prefer to use that label for myself since it does have a colloquial meaning, whereas you don't necessarily have that same issue. So for you, you will take the more formal meaning of agnostic. But the only problem here is now we are delving into the problem with talking with Steve McRae, which is that all conversations lead into this area eventually. But I think the next point that we wanted to get onto, and there's actually something about worldviews we're going to touch on a little later in the video, but one of the things that I wanted to get on right now is the fact that there is a bit of an issue I see, and it seems to be more on the atheist side than on the theist side, and it's an issue with the burden of proof. There's a mislabeling of the burden of proof, and it's starting to get very, very agitating, and I've actually got a few conversations that I'm going to be going over in a podcast that I'll be starting here in the next few weeks, so keep a lookout for information on that. But there's an issue with the burden of proof. The burden of proof typically is going to lie with the person who's making the claim, and that is not always the theist. It is not always the theist, and that's something that's really bothersome, and I think that a lot of people have kind of misappropriated the idea of the burden of proof in a way that just kind of benefits them. They use it as a conversation stopper, because if you use burden of proof and you use it to mean something very specific and say, well, you need to prove this to me, you have a burden of proof, that doesn't actually allow for conversation at that point. It's a conversation stopper. Not to mention, if you're sitting there claiming that no gods exist, at this point you've made a claim. And now you've got a burden of proof. But I think Steve can probably suss this out a little better than I could.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. The term burden of proof, it's been bantered around, and everybody knows the old adage, if you have a positive claim, you have the burden of proof, or the burden of proof is on the person making the claim. That's a given. But as you said, there are atheists that do make claims. And so when you say atheists don't make any claims, or atheists don't have a burden of proof, that's not a correct statement, because there are atheists. There's a lot of them. I know a lot of people, and I would refer to them as either strong atheists, not the Dawkins version, but just strong atheists, somebody who just believes there are no gods. There's a lot of atheists that hold to that. That is a claim. They have a burden of proof. Where the confusion comes in, however, is that people seem to think that a burden of proof means you have to prove something. It does not. The burden of proof has to go back to way back when, in the days of Sextus Empiricus, when he was trying to determine what makes something rational. And the justificatory thing that he and philosophers think makes something justified to hold a belief, they call that the epistemic burden of proof, okay, or epistemic burden of justification. That's why I kind of prefer to use the word justification over proof, because when you hear that word proof, a lot of people start talking about things like evidential things, or they start talking about what you find in some kind of legal proceeding. That's not what these words mean. However, there are evidential burden proofs. There are things that mean very specific things in law. This is not what we're talking about when we say we have the burden of proof here. When a theist has a burden of proof, all they need to do is demonstrate that they have enough reason and what's called a warrant, which is something that relates the data to the claim, to justify them believing in God. It's an epistemic burden of proof, which they have to themselves. If no one else is around, they still have a burden of proof to justify what they believe. That can be something as just saying that here's my arguments for why I believe theism. If they're rational arguments, he's justified. If he says, well, I believe in God because, little green men from Mars came down and told me God exists, that's probably not a rational justification, right? Because I think most people would probably say that's probably not a good reason to believe in God. So you have to be justified to why you believe something. So people confuse this epistemic burden of proof with an evidential burden of proof. And I would have to actually throw in as well that when you're talking about things like science, let's say you and I are having a discussion about evolution, and I submit that evolution is a fact. When you ask me for my burden of proof on that, all I need to do is show you basically citations from recognizable sources. I can show you peer-reviewed papers. I can show you textbooks, college-level textbooks. I can show you what has been written in peer-review journals.
Which is another issue of misappropriation of philosophical terms. That does not automatically mean that you are now going to fall into the argument from authority fallacy, because there's such a thing as called a proper argument from authority, when you're grabbing from a proper source who is an authority on something. Saying that somebody is an authority on something does not automatically make it fallacious when you appeal to that.
Yeah, these are legit appeals to authority, but all I have to do is show you where the information is. I have no onus, absolutely none, to demonstrate to you that evolution is true. The reason being is because in science, if you disagree with an established theory, the onus is solely upon you to substantiate that claim, period. That is how it works. If you don't like how it works, don't get involved in scientific discussions. Don't try to say that evolution is not true. The onus is upon you, not the person saying that evolution is a fact, because that is established by the mere fact that there is a scientific theory of evolution. The burden of proof has already been met in that regard.
No, and I agree there. And not to mention, when somebody's saying I have the burden of proof, like you said before, it doesn't always mean that they have to prove it to you. That's not what it means. And again, when you say that somebody has to prove something to you, now you're falling, like you said before, into the evidential problem. And the thing with evidentialism is that what is evidence to me and evidence to you could be entirely different things. And so the conversation will probably end up being nothing but going past each other.
That's very true. And not just that, it's just that we may look at evidence differently. It is actually, as you said, I do not have any onus to prove to you anything when I make a self-assessment claim. If I just say, yeah, I believe in God, if somebody says, well, demonstrate that, who the hell are they to say that? I am not making a claim to you such that I am saying that I'm going to demonstrate that there happens to be a God. It's just a self-assessment belief, and it's something that's, when I say something to you as just a simple self-assessment, I'm not telling you that I'm willing to have a dialectic with you. So if you ask me, do you believe in God, and I say yes, you can continue, but I'm under no onus to explain to you why I believe in God. Now, obviously, I have no God belief, so this is a hypothetical. But it's the same token when an atheist goes to a theist and says, well, do you believe in God? And they say yes, and then they start going down this path, well, prove to me God exists, demonstrate to me God exists. And they're like, well, I don't need to. Well, you made a claim. At that point, it's just bullying tactics, because it's not how the burden of proof works. Now, if I say, look I believe there is a God, and I believe that ontologically there is gods in the universe, and I'm stating that to you as something, as a fact, now that's a claim. That's straight up a claim, and then you are justified to ask them, where's your evidence for that? And then if they don't, they say, well, okay, well, I'm just dismissing your claim outright. Obviously, you can do that. But if somebody's just giving you their opinion, they have no onus to demonstrate to you. So stop bantering on with these weird beliefs that you somehow have this onus to justify everything that you have to say. You don't always have to do that.
No, and I can definitely get behind that. And I think that there's one thing that I can't stand, and it's echo chambers. And I think that when you have conversation tactics like that, you distance yourself from people who are from the other side. And when you're doing that, you're doing nothing but reinforcing your own echo chamber. But I do see an issue where a lot of atheists, say on Facebook groups, do nothing but reinforce and pad their own echo chambers. And I'm like, well, if you're an atheist and you are very, very well founded in your belief, then you shouldn't have an issue with engaging in that dialogue, and you should be able to engage in that dialogue honestly, and it shouldn't be an issue for you at all. But there is one thing that the theist side throws at atheism, and I really wish that it would stop. I know that I've been saying a lot of things like, oh, I wish atheists wouldn't do this, and I'm an atheist, so it sounds like I'm shooting across the bow, but I'm really not. I'm trying to point out that this conversation requires two sides, and in order for those two sides to actually have productive conversation, there are some bad habits that simply need to stop. And one of those bad habits is being a theist and saying that atheism leads to nihilism. because that's one, those two things are not mutually exclusive. They're not. Two, you might want to have to define what kind of nihilism you're talking.
Yeah, I think the point needs to be made that there's not just one form of nihilism. So when somebody says that atheism leads to nihilism, well, what does that even mean? I kind of tend to like moral nihilism, which is the position that propositions exist that there are moral facts, but they're all wrong. It's called error theory. Now, it can mean other things too. Moral nihilism can also mean there's nothing inherently immoral or moral. That's also what it means. Or nihilism can mean metaphysical nihilism, right? That there's no actual objects that exist that are concrete.
Yeah, and I think the second one that you mentioned there, when you said that no things are moral or immoral, that's usually the one that atheists are being accused of.
Yeah, but when I say moral nihilism, I'm actually referring to Mackey's error theory. Right? So even then, when somebody says moral nihilism, what do you mean by that? But even still, I bring up to people all the time, there's something called mereological nihilism, which mereological nihilism says there's no objects that exist or more than just rearrangements of other objects, right? Or you can have existential nihilism, which is, life has no meaning. But that's what they're kind of referring to. When a Christian tends to say atheism leads to nihilism, what they're doing is they're selectively taking one form of nihilism and applying it ubiquitously. And that form of nihilism is called existential nihilism. That they think that if you're an atheist, life is basically meaningless, devoid of any kind of meaning or purpose. And I have never yet met an atheist that holds to that. Because I think that most of them do think that there's a purpose to life, at least as far as procreation, being good to others, leaving a mark upon society, being beneficial to society. There's a lot of things that I have a purpose to take care of my daughter, right? We all have purpose in life. We all have goals that we set for ourselves. Maybe even though that many of us believe that after we die there may not be anything else. While we're here, we have things that we think is important to do as individuals, as members of society, and it has nothing to do with believing in God or not believing in God.
No, and I think that would lead into a conversation that I don't want to get into right now because there's a lot to unpack, but the conversation about ultimate meaning, because that's something that's tossed about a lot when you're dealing with the moral nihilism conversation. Is like, oh, well, if you have no eternity, you have no ultimate meaning. I think that's just kind of horse crap. I don't see any reason that would follow, but that's an entire video in and of itself that I'll definitely be making probably in the next few weeks after I get done with my video about pragmatism and get done with a few collaborations that are in the works. Also, if any of you are video game fans in any way, shape, or form, if you would like a character for me to attach some of these philosophical ideas to so that you have sort of a good representation, look at Sans from Undertale. Sans is a character who is an evidential nihilist, but he's not a moral nihilist. He doesn't do anything to stop you if you choose to slaughter everyone around him, but he will, as soon as you hit a certain point where his morals actually start to come into question, he will stop you and he will make your entire life an absolute living hell. But he's also very, very well versed in quantum theory, as far as the story of the game is concerned, and it leads him into being an evidential nihilist. But he still has a moral backbone, and he still has his own set of morality, which is not moral nihilism. So if you want a character to attach some of these concepts to so it makes a little more sense, I would say that's a good character to attach them to.
You can also even go back further to the days of like Dungeons and Dragons when you have these alignments, right? You have lawful neutral, chaotic neutral, lawful evil, neutral good. Those are all based upon concepts of morality.
No, you're 100% right. And if you've ever had to roleplay one of those characters before, and you've had to figure out how would this character act in this particular situation, congratulations, you are now using empathy to have that conversation with a fictional character. I guarantee you can do that with a real person.
Same principle. It is difficult when you're playing a specific alignment in a character, and like you said, you have to think, what would this character do that is in line with their chosen alignment? And sometimes obviously alignments aren't chosen, you can actually change them in D&D, but let's say I usually play neutral good because I think that neutral good has a lot of freedom. They're generally corresponds to what I would be in real life, neutral good, and that makes a character much easier to play. But if you try to have a lawfully good character where you have to do whatever is good deontologically, which is duty bound to laws, you are engaging in moral context.
No, and I definitely agree with that, because when you are trying to be that fictional character, there's definitely a point where you're going to have to try to determine how is this character going to operate if they existed in the real world. And the amount of time and thought process you're going to take into figuring that out, I guarantee you can apply into having more fruitful conversations. Put yourself in your interlocutor's shoes. It's not terribly hard to do. With that said, I think that leads into the next bit. When you are engaging with these types of conversations and you are trying to figure out these different, I don't want to use the term worldview because we've already established it's a bit of a problem, but when you're trying to establish these different types of epistemologies for characters or for people or just in conversation, there's a set of words, a sentence that I think just makes absolutely no sense that we hear a lot. And it's, I hate philosophy, but I like to talk about atheism or theism. And it makes no sense.
It seems to be a contradiction, right? Because people need to realize that the term atheism and theism are philosophical terminology. Matter of fact, ISM, the ism, is something that relates to an ist, which actually means, generally speaking, relating to a proposition. So when they say theism, it means the proposition that God exists. Now, again, that is not a hard, fast rule, but generally isms are relating to propositions. So there's a relationship between the ism and the ist. So if somebody says they are theist, that means they're holding to the proposition of theism. So that all falls under philosophy. So to say that they hate philosophy yet are engaging in talk dealing with atheism and theism, they seem to be doing a performance contradiction of sorts.
Yeah, and the way that I like to word it here is that philosophy is both weapon and shield. And if the weapon is being used against you, typically the best shield is the same thing that the weapon consists of. If somebody's going to be referencing the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and they're going to use that against you in conversation, let's say that they're trying to be a very, very hard philosophical conversation against you, the best thing you can do is not avoid that. The best thing you can do is reference the material and find out where they're wrong.
Well, and that's the problem, though. I see a lot of people will ask for citations and references to Christians and theists when they argue something, right? But when you ask an atheist, what is your citation for this? None is forthcoming half the time. They don't bother to go out and read the literature. They get involved in these discussions, and some of them are very complex. You're dealing with things like subjectivity and objectivity and absolutism and relativism. These are all not easy concepts in moral context. And when people just make these arguments by saying, well, it's this, this, and this, and you say, well, what's your argument for it or what's your citation? They have none because they haven't read things like SEP or IEP or any really major paper that's been out there that most of us have read, like by either Bertrand Russell, or if you read any books by Nagel. I'm reading some stuff by Nagel recently. These are all things that most people that engage in philosophical talk will read, and yet people will get in these conversations and they'll just throw these terms out there. They'll try to talk about it and they make by fiat arguments, but then they say they hate philosophy. And then why are you engaged in the conversation if you don't like philosophy, but you're talking about philosophy?
Yeah, it's a very strange thing for me, and don't get me wrong, I used to do a very similar thing. If anybody looks at like a lot of the earlier videos on my channel, I had very, very basal arguments when it came to things like morality until I actually started reading the material on it, because I was getting almost all of my information from YouTube videos and YouTube debates, and I'm sorry, but typically debates are aimed at the audience. They are not aimed at the person that you are speaking with. And typically, even if you have two people who are at a very high intellectual level, they're going to aim their conversation and their rhetoric to the audience, which is almost always going to be a lay audience. And so when you're listening to these debates and you want to use concepts that are from these debates, you might want to research those concepts after the debate, because the way that they're worded may have been framed in a way that was to make it make more sense to the layperson, but not necessarily adheres to the source material as much as it really should.
And that's the problem. When people have this education from University of YouTube, the vast majority of information they are getting is vastly distilled down for easy digestion, right? And so unless you go to the actual literature itself, you're just getting down as watered watered down version of philosophy. Now, the literature's not easy to read. I am not good at understanding philosophical literature because I have to spend probably 10 minutes per paragraph over and over again reading it to really fully understand what is being said. But a lot of people don't want to take the time to do that. And so when you are having these conversations with somebody and they, again, just make an assertion, a blind assertion saying, look, objective morality doesn't exist. Okay. Can you actually give a valid argument for that? Because, they've discussed this for thousands of years. There's no resolution, right? And I think that a friend of mine said it best the other day. He said, when you go into these conversations dealing about morality, it's probably best just to take the position, just arguendo, that objective morality exists, and then go from there, because whether objective morality exists or not, most of us are not in a position to really weigh into that issue. We are not experienced enough, we're not educated enough, we're not philosophers, we're not PhDs, and I'm telling you, those types of arguments, whether objective morality or subjective morality or things, those are high-level stuff. And so I think that from most people's perspectives, they don't really care so much if objective morality or subjective morality exists. They want to know what that entails if they do, right? And does it necessarily lead to some kind of metaphysical necessity of there being a God? Which that, in that case, is clearly a no.
No, and I think that was pretty much clearly demonstrated during the debate/discussion between S.J. Thomason and Richard Carrier that happened just a few days ago. By the time this video comes out, it will have been a few days ago at least. But I do think that we now have one more thing that we'd like to talk about, one last little bit that honestly really needs to be taken care of. Or there's two bits, but they really do tie into each other. The first part is, don't say you have no beliefs. Don't. If I had a Venn diagram, and I'm actually going to provide a Venn diagram, you would have beliefs on one side of the Venn diagram. And then you would have truth on the other side of the Venn diagram, and where truth and belief come together, you would have knowledge. For you to have knowledge, you have to first have belief. So if you want to use the rhetoric that I believe nothing, I know things, you believed it first, that's how you came to know it. It makes absolutely no sense when you make a claim like that. I think it's because the term belief has been so poisoned in conversation with theists, because there's a very specific version of belief that they're going to use in conversation, which usually corresponds somewhat with faith, and atheists are really bothered by that terminology, and I can understand why you're doing it, but just like every other thing we've talked about in the video so far, there is a misappropriation of terms here. Do not think that because the term has been misappropriated that it is still not a valid term.
Yeah, and these are epistemological terminologies. These are things used in the context of what do we mean to believe? What do we mean by belief, right? And generally speaking, belief is something that you're convinced about. You're convinced that a proposition is true. Knowledge is actually a little more complicated. Knowledge requires a multitude of different things to be required to say that I have knowledge. So you have to have one, it has to be true. The proposition has to be true. You have to believe the proposition, and you have to be justified to believe the proposition, or produced by what's called reliably produced true belief. There are some other things as pragmatic theory of knowledge too, but for the most part, there are three things that require knowledge. Now, all of them, every single theory of knowledge out there has the condition you have to believe P is true. So that is why they say that knowledge is a subset of belief. In order to have knowledge, you first must have belief. So when a person says, I do not believe anything, they are literally telling somebody, I also do not know anything because of entailment, right? So I don't think you want to go in a conversation with a theist saying, hey, by the way, I want to talk to you about your beliefs, but you know what? I don't know anything.
I believe nothing.
But no, worse than that. I know nothing. You're telling a theist that you know nothing when you say you have no beliefs.
No, and I agree with that. And I think what this ties into is the very last point about beliefs. Not having a God belief isn't the only thing that all atheists have in common. Because there are certain things that stem from not having a God belief. For instance, I don't have a God belief. Ergo, I don't have a belief in the concept of sin. So me and almost all atheists will have that in common at least. We do not agree in the concept of sin. Because how can we agree in the concept of sin when the concept of sin requires a deity that we don't believe in? You could also have some atheists who believe in miracles but not in deities. Typically that will have miracle being defined the same way that magic is. But when you get into there, most atheists by not believing in God, are also probably not believing in miracles either. So and typically I hear this being used as a response to a theist when a theist says that, all atheists have this in common. The biggest one we always hear is all atheists believe in evolution, which, by the way, is not true. Not all atheists believe in evolution. I don't know where people get that. There is a higher chance that if you're an atheist, you will agree with the leading theory of evolution, but that does not mean that all atheists by fiat believe in evolution. All atheists that do not have a God belief, or all atheists do not have a God belief, therefore they probably don't believe in sin, and they probably don't believe in miracles. There are more things that they believe outside of just not believing in God.
Yeah, and the way you would frame that would be that sin is defined as a transgression against a divine law, right? And divine basically means God or godlike, okay? So it still means with a God. So when I say that a divine miracle is something that would maybe suspend the laws of physics or something, right? But it comes from a deity, right? Because it's divine, deity, God. Sin is the same way. If you have nothing to have transgressions against, if there's no divine law decreed by a God, then there is no sin. I mean, they go hand in hand. Now, I mean, you can play some semantic argument and say, well, I'm defining it this way and that way. Fine, I get that. But as typically defined by these words in these types of theological and philosophical conversations, sin and divine miracles are contingent upon a deity, because you're transgressing his law. So when you say, I do not believe God or gods exist, you are actually having baggage with that. You are actually at the same time saying, I don't believe the things that come along with a deity, right? Which would be sin, divine miracles, and things of that nature, redemption, salvation. These are concepts that are solely contingent upon there being a deity. Now, that doesn't mean things like hell or heaven. You can believe hell and heaven and still be an atheist, right? I don't know how it would work, but I don't see that as an entailment. I think you can have some kind of belief that there is an afterlife of some sort that you can consider to be heaven and hell that's not strictly contingent upon their existence of a God.
It could be contingent on a deistic God creating it and then the deistic God dying. You're an atheist now at this point who has no gods exist currently, and these things exist because they were there to begin with.
Yep, that is quite possible. Yes,
that's the only way that I could really see sussing that type of belief out of an atheist.
Well, if you allow for a non-immortal deity.
Yes, if you allow for a non-immortal deity, a deistic God that had just enough energy to create the universe and then die is possible.
Yeah, I mean, a good analogy for this would be something like, well, I don't like football. Well, that would also entail that you don't like playing football, right? You don't like watching football. There are things that go along when you have a negative position. That's why we don't frame generally things in negative positions. That's why, as Cyrus knows, I don't like people's definition of I don't believe something, because you're not really saying anything beyond this is what I don't like. Okay, great, but what do you like? Well, I don't want to make a claim. Well, why not? My argument is very simple. The people that are going to be engaging in these types of conversations with atheists will much more likely these conversations with theists are much more likely to change the mind of a theist when you give argumentation, when you give reasons for your position, when you give them arguments such as the logical problem of evil, the evidential problem of evil, divine hiddenness, things that will say, this is why I don't believe there's a God, but more so, this is why I believe gods don't exist. I think that position is a stronger position because, again, just saying that, I don't want to make any claim, by saying you don't believe something, I think there is a second order claim to be had. And I actually wrote a blog on this. It's called Atheist and the Burden of Proof, and another one called Atheist. No, actually, so excuse me, you can cut that part. It's called The Atheist and the Burden of Proof, where I do argue that there's a second order to be had there, because if you say I don't believe gods exist, you are making a claim that in some way you're not believing the person. And so when a person says, I believe X, and you say, well, I don't believe X, you're also saying, I believe that you didn't meet your burden of proof to convince me or yourself. Okay, so by saying I do not believe X, I at the same token saying I believe that I'm not convinced. So there is some kind of second order belief that exists, even with a do not believe claim. Now, that's, again, something that I particularly hold to. I'm willing to take argumentation on that. It's not a hill I'm going to die on, but it just seems to me to follow that by saying I don't believe X, I'm also saying I believe you didn't convince me.
No, and I think that's a fair thing to say. But I think that's pretty much all that we really wanted to talk about in this one video. We are going to be a decent bit past the 30-minute mark, and as uncomfortable as I am with half-hour-long videos, my channel seems to be going in that direction lately, so here we are. But with that said, Steve, where can they find you at?
You can find me at Steve McRae on YouTube. You can also find me as one of the hosts on the Non Sequitur Show on YouTube. We also have a podcast on iTunes. We just reached 130,000 downloads on iTunes. Thank you very much. We also have another channel called The Great Debate Community, where we just kind of do oddball stuff. And if anybody wants to stream on the Great Debate Community their own stuff, if they don't have a channel, they can contact me and actually be a manager and run some of these types of hangouts on their own and kind of cut their teeth on how to run a hangout or how to do interviews. They're more than welcome to do that on the Great Debate Community.
All right, awesome. And links to all that will be in the description below, as well as links to some of the blog articles and a few articles from the Stanford or Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy on some of the topics that we covered today, in case you guys would like to do some further reading, which is something that we would definitely like to see. So with that said, thank you very much again for coming on the channel, Steve, and we look forward to seeing what goes on with the Non Sequitur Show next. Sorry if the audio is a little subpar compared to what you're used to, but that's what happens when we're having live conversations and I'm not actually in studio mode. Please remember to go check out Steve McRae and the Non Sequitur Show whenever you get the chance. And now for the next contest. Do you think morality is objective, subjective, or something else? Let me know using the iCard above, and feel free to discuss your opinions in the comment section below. With that said, everyone, as always, insert end of video tagline here.